Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we travel to Sablewind Pier, a place where fog arrives without warning and people leave without explanation. On certain nights, a stranger appeared at the far end of the pier. He spoke to no one. He waited for nothing, and then one evening, he vanished. No splash, no footprints, no witnesses, only a hat left on the planks, still dry, despite the mist. This is The Vanishing Stranger of Sablewind Pier, a classic mystery investigated by Hercule Poirot. Settle in, lower the lights, and listen carefully, because at Sablewind Pier, absence can be more suspicious than death. Chapter 1. A Figure in the Fog. Sablewind Pier was at its most convincing when it was quiet. By day it looked harmless, a long stretch of weathered planks leading out over grey-green water, lined with lampposts and iron railings. Children ran there in summer, couples strolled in spring, fishermen argued gently in autumn, but at night Sablewind became something else. The sea darkened into a single unbroken surface, the wind sharpened, and fog arrived like an old rumor returning, soft, persistent, impossible to question. It was during that fog that people began to notice the stranger, not because he demanded attention, because he refused it. The first time Mrs. Lillian Harrow saw him, she assumed he was a tourist who had lost his way. It was late October, the kind of evening when twilight lasted longer than it should. Mrs. Harrow had closed her small seaside bookshop and was walking home along the pier, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. The lampposts had been lit early. Their light did not travel far. It sat in small puddles on the planks, surrounded by the fog-like islands. At the far end of the pier, where the railing met darkness, a figure stood perfectly still. Mrs. Harrow slowed. The man did not lean on the railing the way fishermen did. He did not shift from foot to foot the way nervous people did. He did not turn his head to follow the gulls or the distant lights of boats. He simply stood, a tall silhouette in a dark coat, hat brim low, hands clasped behind his back, as if he were waiting for a signal only he could hear. Mrs. Harrow felt a strange urge to speak. "Sir?" she called softly. The figure did not respond. She took a few cautious steps closer. The fog thickened between them, turning his outline uncertain, like a drawing smudged by damp fingers. Then, without hurry, he turned, not fully, just enough for her to glimpse a pale face beneath the hat brim. His eyes met hers for a moment. There was no alarm in them, no warmth either, only an expression she would later struggle to describe, as if he had already decided how the evening would end. Mrs. Harrow's breath caught. "Good evening," she tried again. The man nodded once. Then he turned back toward the sea. Mrs. Harrow did not approach further. She continued walking, telling herself she was being foolish, telling herself a stranger on a pier was no mystery at all. Yet as she passed, she heard something that unsettled her more than the silence. A faint click, like a pocket watch being closed. Within a week, the stranger became part of Sablewind's background, not spoken about loudly, and Sablewind disliked loudness, but mentioned in careful sideways conversations. "Have you seen him? The man at the end of the pier. He's there again, same hour." The consistent detail was the same every time. He appeared when fog began to settle, and he left before it fully cleared. No one ever saw him arrive, no one ever saw him go. Thomas Grell, a fisherman with hands like rope and a temper like tide water, dismissed it at first. "Probably waiting for a sweetheart," he scoffed, rolling a cigarette as he stood near the bait shop. But even Thomas Grell started watching the end of the pier, not because he was curious, because something about the man's stillness felt like ownership. One night, Grell decided to test it. He walked out along the pier, boots thudding softly on damp planks, his breath visible in the lamplight. The fog was thicker than usual, wrapping the railing in white. The stranger stood in the same place as always. Grell stopped a few yards away. "Oi!" Grell called. "You lost?" The stranger did not reply. Grell stepped closer. "This pier closes late, but it closes. You can't just—" The stranger lifted one hand slightly, palm outward. A simple gesture. Not threatening, not pleading, commanding. Grell felt something shift in his stomach, a primitive sense of being warned away by someone who had no right to warn. "You hear me?" Grell snapped, forcing bravado. "Who are you?" The stranger turned slowly. This time, Grell saw the face clearly. The man was not young, perhaps in his late 40s, but his skin was pale and smooth, like someone who spent little time in daylight. His eyes were a grey-blue that looked almost colorless in fog. His mouth moved. For the first time the stranger spoke. "One does not ask the sea who it is," he said calmly. The voice was low, measured, with the faint trace of a foreign accent. Grell's anger faltered. "What does that mean?" he demanded. The stranger tilted his head. "It means you should not ask me questions you cannot afford the answers to." A cold wave moved through Grell. He wanted to laugh, to spit, to insult the man. Instead, he stepped back. When he returned to shore, he did not tell anyone what the stranger said. He told them only this. "He's not waiting for a sweetheart," Grell muttered. "He's waiting for something worse." Soon even the pier's lamplighter noticed. Edwin Marlowe, an older man who had tended Sablewind's lamps for years, was not given to gossip, but on a fog-heavy evening, he found himself pausing mid-task to stare down the length of the pier. The stranger was there, still, as though the pier ended in him. Marlowe adjusted the flame in the nearest lamp and glanced at his own pocket watch. 7:45. He looked again. The stranger had not moved. At 8:15, Marlowe finished the last lamp and turned back toward shore. He glanced behind him. The stranger's head had shifted slightly, angled not toward the sea but toward the town, as though listening through fog for a sound that never reached ordinary ears. Marlowe swallowed and hurried off. That night, he locked his lampshade twice. Then came the evening that made Sablewind stop dismissing the stranger. It was a Sunday. The promenade was quiet, shops closed early, and the sea wind carried a sharper chill than usual. Fog gathered like breath against glass. At 7:30, the stranger appeared. At 8, a young couple, Hannah and Peter Ulrich, walked the pier, laughing softly, their hands intertwined, their footprints damp on the planks. They saw him. They slowed. Peter whispered something to Hannah, and they turned, meaning to go back, but the stranger moved. Only a few steps, not toward them, just away from the railing, as if positioning himself, as if making room for something. Hannah later said it felt like watching a man prepare for a photograph. Then she noticed a detail that made her heart stumble. The stranger's shoes were dry, not merely less wet, completely dry despite the fog and the damp planks. Hannah's voice caught in her throat. Peter squeezed her hand. They hurried back without speaking. When they reached the promenade, Hannah looked back one last time. She saw the stranger lift his arm, as though he were checking the time, and then, impossible though it sounded, she saw him step into the fog and vanish. Not walk away, not turn a corner, simply dissolve. Hannah swore afterward that she did not even hear footsteps, only that faint click again, like a watch closing. By the next morning, Sablewind Pier had acquired a new language. People spoke in half-sentences. They used the word strange like a prayer. And every time fog rolled in, someone would glance toward the pier, silently asking whether the stranger would return. He did, for 3 nights. Same hour, same place, same stillness. Then, on the 4th night, he did not appear, and that absence, and that sudden break in routine, unsettled the town more than his presence ever had, because people had begun to rely on him, the way they relied on fog as a fact of life. And when a fact of life disappears, it leaves questions behind like footprints no one can explain. That afternoon, the police received a letter. No name, no return address, only a single line written neatly in black ink. "Tonight, he will vanish properly." Constable Avery Rook read it twice, his mouth drying. Sablewind Pier was just planks and railings. Yet suddenly it felt like a stage prepared for something dreadful. And somewhere far away on a quiet train line, Hercule Poirot was about to be called. Because when a stranger vanishes without sound, someone, somewhere, has arranged the silence. Chapter 2. When Poirot listened to absence. The train reached Sablewind shortly after noon, breathing out steam like a creature relieved to be rid of its burden. Hercule Poirot stepped onto the platform with deliberate care, adjusted his coat and paused, not to orient himself, but to listen. Coastal towns, Poirot believed, announced themselves before they were seen. Sablewind spoke in muted tones. The gulls cried less urgently. The wind moved sideways instead of forward. And beneath it all was something else, a careful restraint, as though the town were afraid of saying the wrong thing aloud. "Interesting," Poirot murmured. Constable Avery Rook approached, cap in hand, face drawn tight with the kind of worry that had not yet decided how to explain itself. "Monsieur Poirot," Rook said, "thank you for coming so quickly." Poirot inclined his head. You wrote that a man vanished. Rook swallowed. Yes, sir, but not like people usually vanish. Poirot smiled faintly. They rarely do. The pier in daylight, Sablewind Pier, looked disappointingly ordinary by day. Sunlight revealed weathered planks, iron railings flecked with rust, and lampposts that seemed embarrassed by the attention. Children's footprints marked the boards near the promenade. Fishermen argued near the bait shop. A woman leaned on the railing, staring out to sea. Poirot walked slowly, cane tapping softly. Where did he stand? Poirot asked. Rook pointed. The far end, always the same spot. Poirot nodded. Of course, he said. A man who chooses a routine is not improvising. They reached the end of the pier. Poirot stopped exactly where the stranger had stood. He closed his eyes. The sea breathed beneath him. Wind brushed his cheek. The railing vibrated faintly, not from waves, but from footsteps further back on the pier. Poirot opened his eyes. Constable, he said. He, gently. How many people saw him arrive? Rook hesitated. None, sir. And how many saw him leave? Rook frowned. Also none. Poirot nodded. Then the vanishing is not the mystery. Rook blinked. It's not? Poirot tapped his cane once. The mystery, he said, is why people believed they were seeing a man at all. The witnesses, Poirot insisted on speaking to the witnesses individually and in the order of their attention, not their authority. First came Mrs. Lillian Harrow, the bookseller. She sat stiffly in her shop, hands folded, eyes darting to the window as fog drifted lazily past outside. He never frightened me, she said quickly. Not exactly, Poirot nodded. Then what did he do? She searched for words. He made me cautious. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, the correct response? He leaned forward. You heard a sound, Poirot said. A click. Mrs. Harrow's breath caught. Yes, like a watch. Poirot nodded. And did you see him open it? No. Did you see him close it? No. Poirot smiled gently. Then you did not hear a watch, Mrs. Harrow frowned. But you heard timing, Poirot said softly. Your mind supplied the mechanism. She stared at him. Poirot thanked her and stood. Next came Thomas Grell, the fisherman. Grell stood with arms crossed, defiant even in daylight. He spoke to me, Grell said. Warned me. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Warned you of what? Grell hesitated. That I shouldn't ask questions. Poirot nodded. And yet you did. Grell scowled. What's that supposed to mean? Poirot's tone remained calm. You did not retreat because you were threatened, Poirot said. You retreated because the stranger behaved as though you were out of place. Grell shifted uncomfortably. Poirot continued. Tell me, Monsieur Grell, when he lifted his hand, did it feel like a gesture or a signal? Grell opened his mouth, then closed it. A signal, he muttered. Poirot smiled faintly. Then came Edwin Marlowe, the lamplighter. Marlowe's hands shook slightly as he described the stranger's habit of turning his head toward the town. He listened, Marlowe said. Not to the sea, to us. Poirot nodded. And you never approached him? No, sir. Why? Marlowe swallowed. Because it felt like interrupting something already in progress. Poirot's eyes sharpened. That, he said softly, is very important. Finally, Poirot spoke to Hannah and Peter Aldridge together. They described the dry shoes. Poirot didn't interrupt. When they finished, he asked only one question. Did either of you see the stranger's footprints? They exchanged glances. No, Hannah said slowly. I didn't. Poirot nodded. And yet, he said gently, you assumed he walked there. Poirot's first conclusion. As evening approached, Poirot returned alone to the pier. Fog gathered early. Obedient as ever, Poirot stood at the far end and allowed the town to watch him. Some did, some pretended not to. Poirot smiled. So, he murmured, the stranger did not vanish. He tapped his cane once against the planks. He was never present in the way they believed. Poirot turned back toward shore. Constable Rook, he called softly. Rook hurried forward. Tonight, Poirot said, we will not look for the stranger. Rook frowned. Then what will we look for? Poirot's eyes gleamed. For who benefits when everyone looks at the fog? The pattern emerges that night. Poirot did not wait for darkness. At precisely 7:30, he stationed himself halfway down the pier. He watched who slowed their steps, who glanced toward the end, who checked the time. At 7:45, he saw it. A pause rippled through the town. Not because someone appeared, but because people expected someone to appear. Poirot smiled. Expectation, he murmured, is the most reliable accomplice. At 8, fog thickened. Poirot walked deliberately to the end of the pier. There was no stranger. Yet the town behaved as though he were there. Voices lowered, footsteps hesitated, eyes avoided the far railing. Poirot turned slowly, surveying them. "No," he said softly. "This is not a haunting." He tapped his cane once more. "This is choreography." Back at the constabulary, Poirot opened his notebook and wrote a single line. "The pier remembers a man who trained it to look away." He closed the notebook. "Constable," he said calmly, "the stranger did not vanish." Rook leaned forward. Poirot finished. "He retired." Chapter 3. The man who benefited from fog did not cause the mystery at Sablewind Pier. Fog merely made it profitable. That, Hercule Poirot decided, was the first truth worth keeping separate from superstition. The morning after his revelation that the stranger had never existed in the way people believed, Poirot requested something unusual from Constable Avery Rook. "I wish," Poirot said calmly, "to see the pier as the fog sees it." Rook blinked. "Sir?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Without imagination." The pier without story. They walked the length of Sablewind Pier slowly, stopping at every lamp-post, every break in the railing, every subtle curve in the planks. Poirot noted distances. From the promenade to the midpoint, 28 paces. From midpoint to the far railing, 17. From the lamppost halo to the fog wall, barely 6. "Constable," Poirot said gently, "how far can one see clearly on a foggy night?" Rook frowned. 10 feet, perhaps. Poirot nodded. "And how far can one recognize a shape?" Rook hesitated. "Farther than that." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Exactly," he said. "Recognition is cheaper than certainty." Poirot stopped at the far end of the pier. "Now," he continued, "tell me, where did the stranger always stand?" Rook pointed. "There, against the railing." Poirot nodded. "And what stands behind that point?" Poirot asked. Rook turned. Nothing but fog, and a small metal ladder fixed to the pier's underside, descending toward the water. Rook frowned. "That's been there for years." Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, and rarely noticed." The mechanism of illusion. Poirot knelt, examining the ladder's top rung. It was dry, not weathered dry, recently dry. Poirot straightened slowly. "Constable," he said softly, "how does a man vanish without footprints?" Rook swallowed. "By not walking away." Poirot nodded. "And how does a man appear without arriving?" Rook's eyes widened. "By coming from below," Poirot finished. The stranger, Poirot concluded, had never approached the pier like an ordinary pedestrian. He had emerged from a small boat hidden beneath the pier, from a ladder masked by fog and shadow, from the assumption that no one looked down. Poirot tapped the railing lightly with his cane. "The fog," he said, "was not hiding him. It was hiding the method." The timing that made it possible. Poirot asked Rook to bring him the lamplighter's schedule. Edwin Marlowe's rounds were precise. First lamp, 7:20, last lamp, 7:45. After that, the pier's lighting remained unchanged for the night. Poirot nodded. "And when did the stranger usually appear?" Poirot asked. Rook consulted notes. "Just after 7:30. Poirot smiled faintly. "So," he said, "he climbed into the light while the lamps were being adjusted." Rook exhaled slowly, meaning no one could be sure when he arrived. "Exactly," Poirot said. "He entered during uncertainty." The first concrete suspect. Poirot did not ask who could do this. He asked who benefited. The answer came from paperwork, not gossip. For the past 4 months, shipping manifests from Sablewind showed irregular, nighttime movements, small cargo transfers logged vaguely, times rounded carelessly, inspections waived. Rook frowned as he read. "These shipments don't make sense," he said. Poirot nodded. "They are not meant to." Poirot pointed to a name repeated quietly across the documents. Jonathan Hale, a local logistics broker, licensed, unremarkable, and almost invisible in town gossip. "He handles night transfers," Rook said. "Small consignments." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And who benefits from a pier where people do not linger and do not ask questions?" Rook looked up slowly. "Hale." "Jonathan Hale," observed Poirot, did not summon Hale immediately. He preferred observation. That evening, Poirot positioned himself near the promenade at 7:15. Jonathan Hale arrived at 7:22. Not onto the pier. Near it, he stood where fog first began to blur faces and checked his pocket watch. "Once, precisely." Poirot smiled faintly. "Timing again," he murmured. At 7:31, Hale glanced toward the end of the pier. There was no stranger. Yet Hale's shoulders relaxed. Poirot noted that too. At 7:40, Hale walked away, down a narrow side path toward the rocks beneath the pier. Poirot followed at a distance. He watched Hale pause, adjust his coat and wait, not nervously, patiently. At 7:46, Hale checked his watch again, just as the lamplighter finished. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Voilà," he murmured, "the end of supervision." The fog's second purpose, Poirot returned to Rook that night. "The stranger," Poirot said calmly, "was never meant to be seen clearly." Rook nodded. "He was meant to be felt," Poirot smiled. "Yes, to make the pier predictable." People avoided the far end, couples turned back early, fishermen cleared out sooner, leaving the underside of the pier and the water beneath remarkably private. Poirot leaned closer. "And every night the stranger appeared," Poirot continued. "A small transfer occurred below." Rook's mouth went dry. "Smuggling," Poirot nodded. "Not of goods alone." The click explained. Poirot finally explained the sound that haunted witnesses. "The click," he said, "was not a watch." Rook frowned. "It was a carabiner," Poirot continued, "a metal clip securing a rope or ladder rung." Rook exhaled sharply. "Every witness heard it," Poirot said, "because their minds wanted a familiar explanation." Rook nodded slowly. "And the dry shoes?" he asked. Poirot smiled faintly. "The man who appeared was never standing in water," he said. "He climbed up after the ladder was wiped." The vanishing on the fourth night, the stranger did not appear. Because he was no longer needed. The pier had been trained, the schedule established, the fog expected. Jonathan Hale had moved operations elsewhere. The performance ended. Poirot closed his notebook. "The stranger," he said, softly, "did not vanish. He was dismissed." Poirot's warning. Poirot finally summoned Jonathan Hale the next morning, not to accuse, to listen. Hale arrived calm, polite, unremarkable. Poirot studied him for a long moment. "Monsieur Hale," Poirot said gently, "tell me, how does one disappear from a place without anyone noticing?" Hale smiled thinly. "One leaves when people stop looking." Poirot returned the smile. "And how does one make people stop looking?" Poirot asked. Hale did not answer. Poirot stood. "We will speak again," Poirot said softly, "because this case is no longer about illusion. It is about what happened the night the illusion failed." Chapter 4. The night the illusion failed. Illusions worked best when they were never tested. At Sablewind Pier, the stranger had trained the town to behave a certain way, to slow down, to turn back, to accept fog as explanation, and for weeks, that choreography had held until the night it did not. Hercule Poirot understood this as he stood with Constable Avery Rook at the pier's entrance just before dusk. The sea was restless, the fog reluctant, and the lamplighter's flame already glowed like a warning rather than a comfort. "Tonight," Poirot said softly, "we stop believing." Rook swallowed. "You think something happened the night he didn't appear?" Poirot nodded. "Not because he vanished, because someone else arrived. The reconstruction begins." Poirot insisted on precision. "They began at 7 o'clock, earlier than the stranger ever appeared, and moved minute by minute. At 7:12, Edwin Marlowe lit the first lamp. At 7:28, the second. At 7:41, The last. Poirot watched from the midpoint, noting how each halo of light reshaped the fog. Shadows thickened at the edges, shapes lost detail but gained suggestion. At this stage, Poirot murmured, people stopped trusting their eyes and started. Trusting habit, Rook nodded. At 7:30, Jonathan Hale was seen near the promenade, exactly as before. He checked his watch once. He did not approach the pier. At this point, Poirot continued, the illusion would normally begin. But that night, the end of the pier remained empty. Rook frowned. So, why did people still turn back? Poirot smiled faintly. Because the pier had learned to do it for him. The missing beat at 7:46, Marlowe extinguished his taper and left. Supervision ended. This was the window the illusion required. But the stranger did not climb up. Instead, something else happened. Poirot led Rook beneath the pier at low tide. The rocks were slick, the air metallic with salt. Beneath the planks, the ladder descended into shadow. Poirot pointed to a scuffed rung. Here, he said. This rung was not used that night. Rook frowned. How can you tell? Poirot gestured to the dust pattern. It was brushed clean the previous nights, not this. Rook's eyes widened. Meaning the ladder wasn't used. Meaning the performance was cancelled, Poirot said. But the appointment was not. Who came anyway? Poirot returned topside. At 8 o'clock, he said. Someone came to the pier expecting privacy. Rook's jaw tightened. Hale! Poirot shook his head gently. No, Hale arranged privacy. Others used it. Poirot pointed toward the far railing. At 8:07, he continued, a man walked the full length of the pier. Rook frowned. No one reported. Poirot raised a hand. Because everyone believed the pier was empty. Poirot tapped his cane. Belief, he said, is louder than evidence. The witness who didn't know they witnessed Poirot called for Thomas Grell again. This time Grell was less defiant. I went out, Grell admitted. Just for air, Poirot nodded. At what time? After 8, Grell said. I didn't go far. Poirot leaned in gently. You heard something, Poirot said. Grell hesitated. I heard voices. Rook stiffened. Quiet, Grell continued, like they didn't want the fog to overhear. Poirot nodded slowly. And then? Poirot asked. Then I heard a shout, Grell said. Not loud, more like surprise. Poirot's eyes sharpened. And then? Something hit the railing, Grell whispered. Hard. Silence followed. Poirot exhaled slowly. And did you look? Grell shook his head. No, I thought it was the stranger. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. No, he said softly. It was the illusion ending. The first real crime, Poirot and Rook followed Grell to the exact spot. There, beneath the far railing, a small piece of torn fabric was caught on a rusted bolt. Rook crouched. That wasn't there before. Poirot nodded. Because the stranger never touched the railing. Poirot looked down at the water. At low tide, he said, the rocks below are visible. At high tide, they are not. Rook swallowed. Poirot continued. Someone was pushed, or fell, or was made to choose between resistance and gravity. Rook's voice dropped. A body? Poirot shook his head. Not yet, he said, but now the case changes. He straightened. This, Poirot said, is no longer disappearance. It is vanishing with intent. The illusion's fatal flaw, Poirot returned to the constabulary and laid out the sequence. The stranger trained the pier to empty itself. Hale benefited from the routine. Others learned to exploit the privacy. On the 4th night, the stranger was removed. The routine remained, and someone, Poirot concluded, used that routine to commit violence. Rook clenched his fists. Who? Poirot's gaze was steady. Someone who believed the illusion still protected them. Poirot's quiet warning that night. Poirot walked the pier alone. Fog gathered again, obedient but no longer in charge. He stopped at the far end and looked down into the dark water. An illusion, Poirot murmured, is only safe until it is shared. He turned back toward shore. Tomorrow, he said quietly to the empty pier, we stop asking how he vanished and start asking who came when no one was watching. Chapter 5. The body the fog could not keep, the sea gives back what it borrows. It may take its time, a tide, a night, a week, but it doesn't keep secrets forever. Hercule Poirot knew this as he stood on the rocks beneath Sablewind Pier at first light, boots braced, eyes trained on the slow retreat of the tide. "Low water," he murmured. "Truth prefers it." Constable Avery Rook nodded beside him, jaw tight. "If there's anything down there," Poirot inclined his head. "There will be." What the tide revealed. At dawn, the water slipped away from the stones with a sound like a sigh. Seaweed clung to iron struts. Barnacles glittered wetly, and there, wedged between two dark rocks directly below the far railing, lay a shape that fog had hidden and routine had ignored. A body. It was face down, coat caught on a protruding stone, one arm twisted at an angle that explained everything without words. Rook swore under his breath. Poirot did not move. "Observe," he said calmly. "Do not react." They descended carefully. The coat was heavy with water, the fabric torn where it had snagged the rusted bolt above. The man's shoes, the same shoes witnesses had sworn were dry, were scuffed now, their soles torn. Poirot crouched. "He fell," Rook said, "or was pushed." Poirot nodded. "After 8, before full tide," Rook swallowed. "So the vanishing was a fall," Poirot finished gently. "Not a disappearance. Identity without a name. The body carried no papers, no wallet, no letters, no watch. Only a ring, plain gold, worn thin. On the right hand." Poirot studied it closely. "A married man," Rook said quietly. Poirot shook his head. "No inscription, no polish. This ring was not worn for love." Rook frowned. "Then why wear it?" Poirot's eyes sharpened. "To suggest something." They found the real clue in the lining of the coat, a small stitched tag, expertly concealed, a laundry mark. H27, Rook blinked. "That's it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "It is enough." The missing man, by mid-morning, Poirot had his answer. H27 belonged to a coastal lodging house on the cliffs beyond Sablewind, a place used by transient workers and men who paid cash. The proprietor produced a ledger after brief hesitation. "One man," she said, "checked in under the name Evan Shaw. Stayed 3 nights." Poirot nodded. "And the ring?" She pursed her lips. "He asked for it, said it helped with a part." Poirot thanked her and closed the ledger. "An actor?" Rook asked as they stepped outside. Poirot's mouth curved slightly. "A performer, yes, but not for applause." Evan Shaw was not the stranger. Poirot laid the facts plainly. "The man who died," he said, "was not the stranger of legend." Rook frowned. "But everyone saw." Poirot raised a finger. "Everyone believed," he corrected. "Belief is economical," Poirot continued. "Evan Shaw was hired, paid to arrive on the 4th night, the night the original illusion was withdrawn." Rook's eyes widened. "So he took the place of the stranger." "Briefly," Poirot said. "Long enough to keep the routine intact." Rook's voice dropped. "And someone came expecting privacy." Poirot nodded. "And met a man he did not recognize." The confrontation reconstructed. Poirot returned them to the pier, step by step. "At 8:03, he said, "Evan Shaw walked the pier. He believed he was alone." Rook nodded. "At 8:06, Poirot continued, "another man followed. A man who thought the pier empty because the stranger was supposed to be present, not absent." Rook swallowed. "Jonathan Hale." Poirot nodded once. "Yes?" They stood at the far railing. "Hale confronts Shaw," Poirot said. "Words are exchanged. Shaw does not understand the signal. He steps back." Poirot pointed to the bolt. "Here," he said softly. "The struggle." Rook closed his eyes. "And the fall." Poirot nodded. "Not planned, not intended, but inevitable." "Why the stranger disappeared," Rook paced. "Then why did Hale remove the stranger in the first place?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Because the stranger had become too effective," he said. "People were noticing the pattern?" Poirot continued. "Hale ended the illusion but kept the routine." Rook exhaled sharply. "And it killed someone." Poirot nodded. "Yes." The evidence Hale forgot. Poirot returned beneath the pier once more. There, half hidden by kelp, lay a rope cut cleanly. Poirot lifted it. "A carabiner," he said softly, "removed in haste." Rook's voice was tight. "The click," Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, the sound that taught the town to imagine." The arrest Jonathan Hale did not resist. When confronted with the rope, the ladder, the ledger, and the timeline, his calm collapsed into arithmetic, too many facts, no remaining gaps. "I didn't push him," Hale said hoarsely. "He stepped back." Poirot inclined his head. "Because you took away the language he expected." Hale stared at him. "You taught this peer to behave," Poirot continued gently. "Then you changed the rules without warning." Hale sank into the chair. "I never meant," Poirot interrupted softly. "Intention," he said, "is not a flotation device." What remained? As Hale was taken away, the fog lifted slightly. Rook stood beside Poirot, exhausted. "So the stranger," Rook said quietly, "was real only as long as people believed." Poirot nodded. "And dangerous once belief outlived control." Rook looked toward the sea. "And Evan Shaw?" Poirot's gaze softened. "He died because he did not understand the script." Poirot closed his notebook, "which," he added, "is always the risk of performance." That evening the pier was closed early. No fog, no signals, no shadows at the far railing. Only wind, water, and wood. Ordinary things that no longer pretended to be something else. Poirot watched the tide rise again. "It will not hide him now," he murmured. Chapter 6. The Habit That Turned Deadly. The law moved through Sablewind the way fog once had, quietly, efficiently, and without apology. By the morning after Jonathan Hale's arrest, the pier was no longer a place of speculation. It had become a site of procedure. Measurements were taken, statements revised, times corrected. The illusion that had once protected convenience now offered no shelter at all. Hercule Poirot watched this transformation with calm approval. "Routine," he murmured to Constable Avery Rook, "is only harmless until it replaces responsibility." Rook nodded, eyes rimmed with fatigue. "The town's asking questions now." Poirot smiled faintly. "Good. Questions are the tax we pay for comfort." The charges precisely named Jonathan Hale's interview was brief, not because he was cooperative, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. The rope, the ladder, the ledger, the laundry tag, the timeline. Each fact stood where it belonged. "You created the conditions," Rook said evenly, "and you changed them without warning." Hale stared at the table. "I didn't plan a killing." Poirot inclined his head. "No, you planned privacy." Hale's jaw tightened. Poirot continued gently. "And privacy, once normalized, invites others to behave as though consequences have been postponed." The formal charges followed. Involuntary manslaughter, criminal negligence, conspiracy to obstruct maritime oversight. They were not dramatic charges. They were accurate. Hale did not protest. Accuracy, Poirot knew, was often the most devastating verdict. The town response, Sablewind, did not erupt in outrage. It did something more difficult. It recalibrated. The pier reopened with new rules posted clearly at the entrance. No access after dusk, no informal signals, no exceptions. People read them carefully. Some sighed, some nodded, some looked embarrassed. Mrs. Lillian Harrow closed her bookshop early one evening and walked the promenade without once glancing toward the pier's end. She noticed this only later, at home, and felt something loosen in her chest. Thomas Grell avoided the pier altogether for a week. When he returned, he stood firmly in the light, hands in pockets, daring the fog to suggest otherwise. Edwin Marlowe, the lamplighter, adjusted his schedule. "I won't light them early any more," he told Rook. "Let the dark be honest." Poirot approved. The pier without a roll. At sunset, Poirot stood halfway down the pier. No fog, no audience, no choreography. The far railing looked smaller now, just iron and bolts, stripped of meaning. Rook joined him. "It feels exposed," the constable said. Poirot shook his head gently. "It feels accurate." Rook frowned. "All that trouble just because people got used to looking away." Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes," he said. "Habits are very persuasive liars." Evan Shaw remembered properly. Arrangements were made for Evan Shaw's burial. No family came forward immediately. The lodging-house proprietor attended quietly, hat in hand. So did Mrs. Harrow, who brought a book she thought he might have liked, and then felt foolish for assuming. Poirot stood apart. He played a role he did not understand, Rook said softly. Poirot nodded. Which is why he paid the highest price. Rook looked down. Is there justice in that? Poirot's eyes softened. Justice, he said, is rarely symmetrical. Poirot's moral verdict. That evening Poirot wrote in his notebook, not evidence, but reflection. The most dangerous thing at Sablewind was not fog, nor darkness, nor a stranger. It was agreement without accountability. He closed the book. Rook watched him. You always write something at the end. Poirot smiled. Only when the lesson is portable. Rook hesitated. And what is the lesson here? Poirot gestured toward the pier. When people outsource caution to symbols, he said, they become vulnerable the moment those symbols change. Rook nodded slowly. The last walk before leaving Poirot took one final walk at dusk. He did not wait for a stranger. He did not look for fog. He listened to ordinary things, footsteps, water, wind, all behaving honestly. At the far end, he paused and looked down into the sea. It is finished, he murmured, properly, as he turned. Back, a child ran past him laughing, chased by another, their voices echoing freely across the planks. No one shushed them, no one expected a signal. Poirot smiled. That, he thought, was the true end of the case. Chapter 7. The Town That Learned to Look Again. Sablewind did not mourn loudly. It never had. Instead, it did something far more revealing. It adjusted its gaze. In the days following Jonathan Hale's arrest, the town behaved as though it had woken from a long, uneasy sleep. Shops opened on time. Fishermen argued openly again. People lingered at the promenade without inventing reasons to turn back. And the pier, once a stage, returned to being what it had always been before the illusion claimed it. Wood, iron, water. Hercule Poirot noticed the change immediately. He noticed it in the way people met one another's eyes, in the way they spoke without lowering their voices, in the way fog arrived and was treated at last like weather, not instruction, a pier. Without a role on Poirot's final morning in Sablewind, he walked the pier at an hour it had once avoided, early evening. Children leaned over the railing with fishing lines, an elderly couple strolled arm in arm. A vendor sold warm pastries near the promenade, the scent drifting freely across the planks. No one glanced toward the far end. No one expected a figure to be there. Constable Avery Rook joined Poirot midway down the pier. They say it feels different now, Rook said. Poirot nodded. Because it is. Rook hesitated. People keep asking me why they didn't see it sooner. Poirot smiled faintly. Because they were trained not to. The stranger reconsidered. The legend of the stranger did not vanish overnight. Stories lingered, and they always did. Some claimed he had been a ghost, others insisted he was a warning. A few still preferred to believe he had simply walked into the sea. Poirot did not correct them. Every town, he said gently, needs one. Harmless story to retire gracefully. What mattered was not how the stranger was remembered. It was how he was no longer used. Evan Shaw, properly named arrangements were finalized quietly. Evan Shaw's true name was recorded. His body was returned to his sister, who arrived days later, tired, composed, grateful for clarity, even when it hurt. Poirot watched from a distance as she stood at the pier's edge, looking down into the water. He was always good at playing parts, she said softly to Rook. I just didn't know which one he was in this time. Poirot lowered his head. Roles, he knew, were dangerous when written by someone else. Poirot and Rook. On the afternoon of Poirot's departure, Rook walked him to the station. You could have left earlier, Rook said. After Hale confessed. Poirot adjusted his gloves. Confession ends a case. Understanding ends a habit. Rook considered that. Will it last? He asked. Poirot paused before boarding the train. That depends, he said, on whether they remember discomfort longer than convenience. Rook smiled faintly. I think they will. Poirot nodded. Good. A final look from the train window, Poirot caught one last glimpse of Sablewind Pier. It looked smaller now, not diminished, simply stripped of borrowed importance. Fog hovered lightly above the water, undecided, and the pier stood unchanged beneath it, no longer asking permission from anything unseen. Poirot sat back and closed his eyes. The rhythm of the rails steadied his thoughts. Poirot's reflection. Some mysteries ended with revelation, others with justice. This one ended with awareness. Poirot reflected on the case not as a disappearance, nor even as a death, but as an education. A town had learned that familiar patterns could be manipulated, silence could be engineered, and absence could be more controlling than presence. Most importantly, it had learned to look again. The pier. Dusk. That evening, Sablewind's Pier was full, not crowded, alive. Laughter echoed, footsteps overlapped. A boy dropped a coin between the planks and swore loudly enough to be scolded. No one shushed him, no one glanced toward the far railing, and when fog rolled in later that night, it was met with lamplight and conversation, not expectation. The stranger did not return. He never needed to. Closing, thought Poirot wrote one final line in his notebook before setting it aside. The most convincing illusion is the one that teaches others to participate. He closed the book. The case was finished, and Sablewind, at last, belonged to itself again. Chapter 8. When silence was finally ordinary. Silence returned to Sablewind Pier slowly, not all at once, not like a switch being turned off, but the way evening arrives when no one is watching the clock. It settled into corners first, then spread across habits, conversations, and expectations until one night it no longer felt like something to be explained. It simply was. That was when Hercule Poirot knew, even from a distance, that the case had truly ended. The days after the departure, weeks passed. The town did not commemorate the stranger. No plaque appeared. No guided story was invented for visitors. Sablewind had learned something more valuable than remembrance. It had learned restraint. The pier reopened fully under its new rules, but after the first few days, people stopped reading the sign altogether. Not because they ignored it, but because it had become unnecessary. The behavior it described had already been adopted. Fishermen left earlier, not later. Couples lingered without checking the far end. Children ran freely, unconcerned with shadows. And the fog, faithful as ever, rolled in and out without commanding attention. What became of the stories, of course, did not disappear. They softened. What had once been told with urgency was now told with distance. The man in the fog, someone would say casually, that was a strange time. No one lowered their voice anymore. No one looked toward the pier as they spoke. The story had lost its leverage. That, Poirot would have said, was the sign of recovery. Jonathan Hale, reduced to a file. Jonathan Hale's case moved through the courts without complication. There were no dramatic reversals, no public outcry, no sudden revelations. The evidence did not require persuasion. Involuntary manslaughter, criminal negligence, abuse of maritime access. The sentence was not light, nor was it excessive. It was proportional. Poirot approved of that most of all. Evan Shaw remembered correctly. Evan Shaw's sister returned once more before leaving Sablewind for good. She stood at the end of the pier at dusk, coat pulled tight, watching the water with the focused stillness of someone determined not to imagine too much. Constable Avery Rook stood nearby, respectfully distant. He always said places mattered, she said quietly. That some places made people behave strangely. Rook nodded. This one did, she smiled faintly. Not anymore. She left without ceremony, and that, Poirot would have noted, was a kindness. A letter that arrived late. Nearly a month after Poirot's departure, a letter arrived at his London address. It was written in careful hand. Monsieur Poirot, the pier creaks the same as it always did, but people don't pause anymore when it does. I thought you'd like to know. Poirot folded the letter neatly. Yes, he murmured. That will do. Poirot's final reflection. In his quiet sitting room, Poirot poured tea and sat by the window. London made its usual noises. Carriage wheels, distant voices, clocks that kept time without apology. He reflected on Sablewind, not as a solved mystery, but as a corrected behavior. The stranger had never truly mattered. Neither had the fog. What mattered was how quickly people surrendered responsibility to pattern, and how difficult it was to reclaim it. Poirot sipped his tea. People, he said softly, will accept almost anything if it arrives on schedule. He set the cup down, and they will forgive almost everything if it becomes familiar. The pier, long after midnight one night, long after the case had faded from conversation, Sablewind Pier stood empty under a thin veil of fog. A lamppost flickered. The water moved. Nothing else happened. No figure appeared. No silence demanded interpretation. No town held its breath. The pier remained just a pier. And that was its redemption. Closing thought, radio-style, soft. And so, dear listener, the mystery of Sablewind Pier does not end with a revelation, but with a return. A return to ordinary sounds, to unremarkable evenings, to silence that means nothing at all. For the most dangerous silence is not the one that hides truth, but the one people agree to obey. Good night, and may your habits never replace your judgment. Chapter 9. The second disappearance, Sablewind Pier, had returned to ordinary life so convincingly that for a time the town almost believed it had imagined the entire affair. The fog still came, it always would, but now it arrived without ceremony. People did not treat it like a signal. They treated it like weather. Lamps glowed steadily, footsteps continued. Conversations did not lower themselves into superstition, and because the town had relaxed, it missed the only thing it should have noticed. A second disappearance is always quieter than the first. A name that should not have returned. It began with a letter, not to Poirot, he was far away now, but to Constable Avery Rook, delivered by a boy who claimed it had been slid beneath the station door before dawn. No stamp, no sender, no return address. Just a single line, written neatly, almost politely. You arrested the broker, not the owner. Rook read it twice, the words drying his mouth. He told himself it was mischief. Yet the paper was expensive, the ink was deliberate, and the handwriting had that same calm precision that had made the first warning so unsettling. Rook locked the letter in his drawer, then immediately regretted it, because regret was the mind's way of announcing danger. The ledger that didn't balance Sablewind's harbor office kept records with the diligence of people who feared embarrassment more than crime. After Hale's arrest, the authorities had audited everything. Everything. Except one ledger. It had been missing at the time, which was understandable. Papers went astray in panic. But now it had returned to the shelves, as if it had merely been misplaced. Rook found it that afternoon. It looked ordinary, but when he opened it, he felt a small chill of recognition. The entries were too neat, not accountant neat, performance neat. Every line was consistent, every number aligned, every correction looked intentional. And there, on the inside cover, was a tiny mark. H27. Rook's stomach tightened. That mark again. A laundry tag number that had already killed one man. The lodging house revisited. Rook went back to the coastal lodging house on the cliffs. The proprietor's eyes narrowed as soon as she saw him. "Don't tell me there's more," she muttered. Rook showed her the mark, her face drained of color. "That's not a room number," she said quietly. Rook frowned. "What is it then?" she swallowed. "It's what they called the packages." Rook felt the pier tilt slightly in his mind. "Who?" he asked. The woman looked away toward the sea as if hoping it might answer. "Men who came at night," she whispered. "Not often, but regularly. They weren't like Hale." Rook's jaw clenched. "Better dressed?" he asked. She nodded once. "And quieter," she added. "The quiet sort who never needs to raise his voice." A man who never came to the pier that evening. Rook stood on the promenade, watching the pier in the thin fog. For weeks, he had looked down it, expecting a silhouette. Now he looked for something else. A man who never walked the pier because the people with real power did not take risks. They sent Hale, they sent Shaw, they sent the stranger, and they stayed in the shadows where audits could not reach. Rook waited. At 7:41, the old moment when the lamplighter finished, a figure appeared, not at the pier's end, but near the rocks below. A man in a dark coat, not climbing up, climbing down. Rook's breath caught. The figure moved with confidence, as if he knew the pier would not look back. Rook followed at a distance, heart pounding. The man paused beneath the pier, then opened a small metal case. A faint click sounded across the water. Not a watch, not imagination. A clip, a carabiner. Rook felt his skin prickle. The sound that had haunted witnesses was real. And it was back, the third body that wasn't there. Rook watched the man attach the clip to something hidden. A rope or line disappearing into the darkness beneath the pier. The man pulled once, twice, then stopped. He looked upward, not toward the end of the pier, but toward the midpoint. as if he knew exactly where someone would hide if they were watching. Rook froze. The man smiled faintly. Then he did something that made Rook's blood run cold. He spoke softly, calmly, as if addressing fog itself. "You're late," the man said. Rook did not move. The man waited. No reply came. And then, with the same measured patience, the man turned and walked away into the shadows. Rook stayed hidden until the tide shifted. When he finally stepped down, shaking, he searched beneath the pier. There was no body, no package, no rope, only wet stones and the faint impression that something had been moved recently. Rook returned to the promenade with his breath burning. He understood then this was not smuggling. It was extraction. Someone had used Sablewind Pier not to bring things in, but to take things out. The only person to tell Rook telegraphed Poirot that night, not with drama, with accuracy. Second operator observed, "Hail not primary, request advice." He did not sleep. He watched the pier from his window like a man who had learned the cost of turning away. Poirot's reply arrived the next morning, brief and devastating. "Mon ami, you have found the true stranger. Do not follow. Observe only. The owner always returns to collect." Rook read it 3 times. Then he did the hardest thing in policing. He waited. Chapter 10. The Man Who Never Needed to Appear. The most dangerous men are rarely dramatic. They do not vanish into fog. They do not stand at the end of piers. They do not teach towns how to look away. They simply own the habits that others obey. That was the truth Hercule Poirot understood the moment he read Constable Avery Rook's telegram. Second operator observed, "Hail not primary." Poirot folded the paper neatly, as if the message were no surprise at all. "Bien sûr," he murmured. "The owner never performs." The return without arrival. Poirot did not return to Sablewind by train. He arrived quietly by car after dusk, without announcement, without luggage beyond a small case. He did not go to the pier. He did not go to the station. He went to the Harbour Authority offices, because men who own systems prefer desks to shadows. Inside, ledgers were stacked with bureaucratic precision. Permits hung framed on walls. Charts of tides and shipping lanes were marked in careful ink. Poirot ran a finger lightly across one chart. "You see, mon ami," he said softly to Rook later, "smugglers love chaos, but owners love order." The name that never appeared. The missing ledger told its story slowly, not in entries, but in omissions. One name never appeared on night transfer paperwork. One signature never appeared on approvals. One official never needed to justify presence. Arthur Bellamy, senior maritime assessor, 30 years in service. Rook's jaw tightened. "He signed off on everything." Poirot nodded. "And therefore needed to be seen nowhere." Bellamy had approved Hale's licenses. Bellamy had recommended reduced inspections. Bellamy had authorized temporary observational blind zones during fog advisories. Legal language, clean hands, invisible power, the purpose of the stranger. Poirot reconstructed it all in one quiet evening. "The stranger," he said, "was never meant to frighten." Rook frowned, but he did. Poirot shook his head. "Fear is noisy, habit is silent." The stranger trained the pier. Hale managed logistics. Shaw replaced a missing piece. And Bellamy? "He ensured that when questions arose," Poirot said softly, "they were directed downward." Rook exhaled slowly. "So nothing ever reached him?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Until someone stopped obeying the pattern. The trap that required no chase." Poirot did not arrest Bellamy. He invited him. A meeting was scheduled at the harbour office. Routine, dull, in daylight. Bellamy arrived on time, impeccably dressed, mildly amused. "Mr. Poirot," Bellamy said politely, "I hear you enjoy conclusions." Poirot inclined his head. "Only accurate ones." They spoke of tides, of budgets, of inspections. Poirot said nothing accusatory. Then he placed one object on the desk, a small metal carabiner. Bellamy did not flinch, but his eyes lingered for half a second too long. Poirot smiled gently. "That click," Poirot said, "trained an entire town to behave." Bellamy sighed. "So," he said, "you noticed." The confession that wasn't dramatic, Bellamy did not deny. There was no shouting, no threats, no final monologue. "I never pushed anyone," Bellamy said calmly. "I never stood on that pier." Poirot nodded. No, you stood behind it. Bellamy folded his hands. Hale was careless, Shaw was unlucky. Poirot's eyes hardened slightly. And the town? Poirot asked. Bellamy smiled thinly. Efficient. Poirot stood. You are correct, he said softly. Efficiency killed Evan Shaw. Bellamy looked away. That was enough. The end of ownership. Bellamy's arrest did not make headlines. It did something worse. It rewrote procedures. Oversight committees were formed, blind zones were eliminated, fog advisories lost authority, the pier was no longer convenient, which meant it was no longer profitable. Poirot's final walk. On his last night, Poirot walked Sablewind Pier once more. No fog, no signal, no silence asking for obedience, just wind and water. At the far end, he stopped. You see, Poirot murmured, the most effective disappearance is the one that convinces others to vanish for you. He turned back. Classic radio outro, soft closing. And so, dear listener, the mystery of Sablewind Pier ends not with a shadow, but with light. The stranger was real only because people agreed to see him. The silence was dangerous only because it was obeyed. And the true villain never needed to appear at all. Remember this, as the world settles into its nightly routines, when something tells you when to look away, ask who benefits from your absence. Good night, and may your habits always answer to your judgment.